Welcome everybody. Today we're going to be talking about the different types of scientific experiments that you can see in original research papers. Not every original research paper employs the scientific method. Admittedly, non-experimental studies and quasi-experimental studies do not employ pure scientific method with pure isolation of variables, proper controls. Non-experimental employs no control at all. Obviously, these are not concerned with true scientific method, and the only true use of the scientific method comes from randomized controlled trials, which controls for, obviously, the placebo, and a valid control for the scientific parameters, for the study itself. This is not going to be comprehensive, especially for the quasi-experimental section. We're going to devote a video solely to that moving forward, because quasi-experimental obviously gets a little more complex. There are many different types of quasi-experiments. When we're concerned with pure science, realistically, it is slightly meaningless, but again, that's a topic for another time. Realistically, if you're going to be concerned about science, you need to be concerned with experimental studies. And to be able to distinguish these studies in the literature itself is very important. It's usually very clear when somebody employs a randomized controlled trial, because these are the peak, these are the gold standard of science. Just because somebody uses or claims to use a randomized controlled trial doesn't mean that they use the valid control, perhaps to account for placebo, but you have to look at the claims that they're making in regards to that control. Was it a valid control? Because if it's not, it's more quasi-experimental. And honestly, in a way, it's more pseudoscientific if you're not employing the scientific method and you are claiming to use the scientific method properly. So we're going to delve into the different types of studies. We're going to break it down into qualitative versus quantitative, and we're going to get into a little bit of detail into some studies. But again, remember, we're going to do a more comprehensive video on quasi-experimental research moving forward, because this requires a much larger discussion. Okay, let's talk about the types of experiments. Now, we can really break this down into two categories. There is quantitative and there is qualitative. Quantitative research is largely numerically based, right? We're using numbers and data to test hypotheses. This is what you see with statistics when you're testing certain values, right? If you think back to Intro to Statistics, you'll understand that's what quantitative research is. It's the population size. So theoretically, in quantitative research, they say the larger the population size, the more accurate the data becomes, which is an interesting theory. Now, it's true that you get closer to the average with a larger data set, which is why we've extrapolated that sort of thinking back further. I don't think that's necessarily the most logical approach, but more on statistics in the future. As for quantitative research, right, we're really testing hypothesis based on numbers. So we're trying to gather numbers. It's all about numbers and data and empirical observation of this data, right? They say that this is the empirical aspect of it. They say the numbers are the empirical aspect of it. Numbers are empirical, which is absolutely foolish, because we know that mathematics is not an empirically based philosophy, right? It is rationalism based, right? No one can see mathematics. It's all based on logic, mathematical logic. These were gifts to us in human reason. So this is what they say is empirical. It should be objective. This is what they're trying to create as well. Objectivity, right? Numbers don't lie. They're trying to create this objectivity, and that's important to consider too. But it's really easy to manipulate data, and when we talk about statistics in the future, we can see that statistics can be easily manipulated based on how they are represented. So quantitative is largely numbers based. Now, qualitative is quite the opposite, right? It's non-numerical. Really what you're looking at is more subjective in nature. At least that's what they claim, that it's more subjective. You're really looking at individual cases here. So when I said the clinical case studies, or case studies in general, often fall under the qualitative branch, because the population sizes are too small to produce any sort of statistics off of, right? So this is statistics, this is observation, this is, really going into depth into somebody's thoughts, right? Often qualitative research papers may be interview based. They may assess the interviews, right? And this can be very valuable as well. A lot of people find these invaluable Personally, I find them very valuable to understand a case so in depth, to become a master of a single case. I think it can be helpful because you can deduce a lot of information from those specific, induce those specific events. And so I think it's valuable. Does it employ the scientific method? Not necessarily, right? You know, you're not really controlling anything. You can't really control this, right? These are usually commentaries and questions and observations of images and symbolisms and things of this nature, right? So you're really assessing small numbers of groups in depth rather than looking at, you know, whatever you may be testing, biomarkers in large numbers, individuals in large numbers to try and gain statistical capabilities. Okay, and we touched on this briefly earlier, but the first type of quantitative research is a non-experimental design. And in essence, a non-experimental design aims not to manipulate or isolate any sort of variables, right? It's not concerned with the variables. It's not concerned with confounding variables. Realistically, this should be only used to generate hypotheses moving forward, right? And so, in a way, the non-experimental research can fall under the qualitative realm. So we can put a little note. And so the non-experimental research is truly correlational, as I mentioned here. It is not concerned with causation, right? No causation should ever be drawn from a non-experimental design. So this includes things like surveys. This includes things like epidemiology research. Qualitative research is non-experimental in a way. Case studies as well. You know, these are the things that don't employ any sort of scientific method where we're isolating variables, where we're concerned with the confounding variables. You know, there's no attempt at trying to do any manipulation of variables at all. It's purely correlational, right? We're purely just observing things in the natural manner. But if you're going to draw theories and trying to establish theories and make them dogma as we do, you know, nothing should be drawn from non-experimental research from a scientific perspective, because in a way that would be a pseudoscientific statement because there's no employment of the scientific method. So next here we have quasi-experimental research. And essentially this is a study where there are limiting factors on the ability to manipulate variables, right? So it may be impossible to isolate a certain variable, or it may be unethical to isolate these variables. And so there's no blindness at all, right? The study is set up in a way to be able to abide by these other factors at play. So rather than, you know, isolating a variable, you know, you have multiple variables that are in different groups, and so you're trying to deduce some sort of information from having multiple groups and seeing how they all act within themselves, and you're trying to use reasoning to make sure that, you know, the thing in question is actually what is manipulating any sort of causal relationship, right? So again, any sort of quasi-experimental research is not necessarily employing proper scientific method, right? It's very easy to be subjective in nature with quasi-experimental, right? What you're aimed to do is objectivity in science, but with quasi-experimental, right, you have to, this is what they say, you have to manipulate the variables to abide by ethical dilemmas or by the limitations of the study at hand. So within the quasi-experimental design, you know, there's no random assignment whatsoever. So there's a couple different types of experiments that fall under this category. So in essence, the types of studies that you'll see under the quasi-experimental are non-equivalent controls, where the control doesn't necessarily align. It's admitted that the control doesn't align with the experimental groups for, again, ethical concerns or limitations of the study. You have case control, you have a pre-post, so the differences in differences. Essentially, you assess the pre-study or the pre-test to a post-test. So you're sort of assessing the individual's perspectives on the study itself. This may be survey-based, this may be biomarker-based, it may be, you know, there's many different factors. Again, what the main thing about the quasi-experimental is that you're not employing the scientific method, right? You're not able to provide a valid control. You're not able to provide isolation of the variables. You're not able to provide these fundamental aspects of the scientific method. And so there's non-random assignment. There's these, they make up all of these reasons why you can't do it for ethical. And, you know, sure, I can appreciate the ethical concerns. But again, should we be drawing any sort of conclusions from quasi-experimental research? If it's not employing the scientific method, then it becomes a pseudoscience. And so this is a problem. At least they admit that it's a quasi-experimental. And so, of course, we have the experimental studies. Largely what we talk about on this channel is experimental, because really everything else we leave to the wayside. It can be valuable in a sense. It may be valuable in a less empirical way. But empiricism truly lies within the experimental, controlled scientific experiments, as taught by Francis Bacon back there in history and the philosophy of science. So within experimental, we obviously have controls, valid controls. Now, the problem is that a lot of experimental studies are actually quasi in nature, but they just don't admit that their controls are invalid. So I mentioned earlier the cupcake studies, you know, where the control makes no sense, and realistically that's a quasi-experimental design, because it would be, you know, a non-equivalent control, right? The control is not equivalent to the research groups, to the experimental groups. In experimental groups, you have a valid control. You have random assignment of individuals. So all of the individuals, you know, get randomly assigned to the control group or to the experimental group or multiple experimental groups, and through that you can collect your data and then interpret that data. So under the experimental group, you have randomized controlled trials, RCTs. This is essentially the gold standard of science. This is what they say is the gold standard of science. Now, as we've highlighted on this channel time and time again, that there needs to be a valid control, there needs to be isolation of the, you know, proper implementation of the scientific method, which doesn't always occur. But in theory, this is the gold standard for scientific research. You know, randomized controlled trials are usually double blind. The researchers and the test subjects, you know, the participants, are blind to the parameters of the studies. Now, obviously, there's a lot of ethical concerns here, but largely individuals are ethically aware, made aware by the study itself nowadays because of the ethics boards. But there's also something called a triple blind study, that the data collectors and processors are blind to the parameters of the study as well. And this is really to account for objectivity. And to me, the gold standard would not be a double-blind randomized controlled trial, but a triple-blind randomized controlled trial, because it's very easy to manipulate statistics and data as well when you're talking about data, like the data collectors knowing the parameters of the study. So a triple-blind randomized controlled trial would be the only gold standard that I would ever consider to be true in, you know, human research, I suppose. For the scientific method. You know, I think data collectors should always be blind, because, you know, objectivity is lost in science. We know that there is a lot of fraud in science. It's admitted by the literature itself. It's admitted by the establishments and the academics themselves. And so what does that say about the literature if those that partake in their livelihoods are based on the literature are admitting this fact? You know, so triple blind is a must. Data collectors being blind is a must, you know, and we're going to go over the statistics moving forward because it's really important to understand how they can be manipulated. You know, we think numbers are true and objective, and that's true in a sense, but there are ways to manipulate it. So data collectors and process should be blind. The results section should be written blind. You know, I understand that the discussion is a reasoning, is a rhetoric piece, right? We're trying to convince the readers that the interpretation is correct, is that their interpretation is the correct one. But the results, the methods, you know, the methods can't be blind, but the results need to be blind. Okay, as for qualitative is quite interesting studies actually. So first we have the phenomenological research. Essentially, you're delving deep into an individual's thoughts and feelings and even subconscious thoughts and patterns that may arise in their decision making. So really you're getting into the nature of the human psyche, right? You see a lot of qualitative research and psychological research. So with phenomenological research, really you're delving deeper into the human cognition, into human behavior, right? Into natural, what is human nature, right? And they claim that it even delves beyond logic, but that is largely debatable. Okay, you also have case studies. This doesn't necessarily have to be a clinical case study. Largely it is, but you see it in psychology as well. Maybe they consider that clinical. Kind of likely depends on the nature, but the case study, right, you're delving into the specifics of a single case or a very small group of cases. And, I suppose this doesn't necessarily have to be an individual. It could be a case study on a particular topic or phenomenon as well, perhaps in economics or business. And it could be valuable to gain valuable insights of the topic at hand, right? So you're really delving deep into a specific subject, into a specific phenomenon. Okay, you also have a sort of narrative model research where essentially you're gathering stories and a narrative from a group of individuals to really delve deep into the aspects of that individual. This is more aimed at embracing the richness and complexity of an individual story, right? Rather than having very general conclusions being drawn from sort of statistics and numbers, right? You're maybe trying to induce a certain amount of information from a very specific premise, from a very specific story. Okay, you also have action research, which essentially the researchers and participants are collaborating together to identify problems, highlight solutions, work through situations to better the situation of the individuals, of the participants. This is often seen in educational settings, things of this nature. Now, the qualitative research does get pretty redundant, but basically I hope you guys understand the premise of qualitative research, that it usually is a case study based, right? So it's usually very small numbers, it's very specific in nature. You're not looking at numerical data, you're really looking into very specific and detailed experiences. You're looking into the details, right? You're getting into the complexity of something. So this is not very much grounded in statistics or even necessarily a scientific method, right? There are no controls, there are no independent or dependent variables at play. Realistically, what they're trying to get at is they're trying to understand what factors might be an independent variable, right? What could have played a role in this person's life? What role did this factor play, right? So as you can see, they're very different approaches. They're both published in literature, right? They're both types of experiments. And so just because someone says they ran an experiment, one doesn't mean that it was a triple-blind randomized controlled trial, which is important to understand. Often a researcher would be very specific because they know that this is the gold standard, right? And often it's double-blind is the more common one. So it's very important to get to know these. You can scour the literature and practice and just kind of learn to identify the different types of paper. Like, it's really important to learn to identify a randomized control trial because and identify a true control, because if you're going to do true science, you want to employ the scientific method properly, which is what I'm trying to teach you guys in this series, right? So if you're going to draw any sort of conclusion or deduce any sort of fact or build any sort of theory based on hypotheses that have been tested, you should be looking at randomized controlled trials, and they should be double, triple blind even, to ensure that there's no fraud happening whatsoever. And again, you got to look at the vested interest. You got to look at what sort of research wasn't published, which is not something you could really look at, but especially when it's concerning clinical trials, how many times did they have to run the clinical trial, right? To get the desired results, because if you keep running it over and over again, or if you have 10 different types of, COVID cupcakes on the market, or, there was way more than 10. There was like a lot of clinical trials going on. Only a few of them passed the first round, and then they go to round 2, and then they all failed. And I don't even know if there's any left on the market now. I don't really concern myself with that sort of nonsense and pseudoscience anymore because it's so foolish. I'm really trying to just give you guys the tools to be able to understand that, just because something is in the literature doesn't mean that it's true. There is the truth out there. The truth is out there. Like, the truth is a very real thing, but it's obvious that the scientific literature hasn't done a great job at really honing in on what the truth is. And I'm mostly speaking about health sciences here. Obviously, we have accomplished great feats when it comes to engineering or architecture or technology. Technology being the newest accomplishment. We've mastered architecture a long time ago. Go look at the old world buildings. One, they're a whole lot more beautiful than what our new world buildings are. Our new cities are certainly pretty ugly compared to the beautiful old world architecture, right? So we've mastered that a long time ago. We mastered engineering a long time ago. This is obvious by looking at any sort of old world buildings or structures compared to the new world ones. Technology, in a way, is new. Seemingly, you might be able to get into an argument that in history that we've been more technologically advanced, that perhaps it was more in alignment with nature or with our own psyches or things like that, and it gets into sort of conspiracy things and what's true history, what's being fed to us. So that's kind of fun to ponder on a little bit at this point. I've looked into it a lot, and I don't really care. I'm kind of just focused on what we can accomplish in today's world, and trying to move that forward, right, to see where we're at right now and how to move forward in the best possible way. So, okay, well, I hope you guys enjoyed that. If you guys did enjoy it, give us a like, comment, share, subscribe. Be greatly appreciated. YouTube's really my bread and butter. I love producing these longer form videos. I really enjoy making them. Make sure you subscribe. That's the most important thing. Share it to a friend. Let's get to 1,000 subscribers. Let me know what you think. I suppose realistically, with the videos in this playlist, you should be able to go and look at the scientific literature and be able to understand, like, okay, well, this is a study. There is no control. This is not a valid control. We're going to get more into the logic, into the reasoning. What is proper logic? What is proper reasoning, to be able to use that in that sense as well. But you just have to use your mind, right? And you have to trust yourself. What is this valid for, like a control, right? Is this valid to control this certain aspect of a paper? So understanding the different types of papers is important. And so I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'll stop rambling now, let you guys go. I really appreciate you guys checking it out. Take care.